I've shared on more than one occasion that of all the sports that are available, well, let me phrase that. Of all the legitimate sports available to watch online or watch in our world, I love basketball. Again, I say legitimate because I also love wrestling. Mandy told me I couldn't possibly work that in my sermon today. I did. But I love to watch, I love to play basketball. It's my favorite, again, of all the legitimate sports. I mean, I love football. Football is great. I'm kind of indifferent towards baseball. I don't really see what all the fuss is about, to be honest with you. And I don't know how we can logically refer to NASCAR as a sport, but, you know, for some people, they love that. That's fine. More power to you. But I love basketball. And more specifically, when it comes to watching basketball, the one that I love to watch the most is actually professional basketball, the NBA. I love college basketball. I love the drama and the passion and all that stuff. I love the NCAA tournament. It's one of my favorite things to watch every year. But I find it hard to get really invested into college level basketball because in a year's time, a large chunk of those players are going to go pro and the team is completely different. So the idea of investing in them on a personal level is kind of difficult to do when you know next year they're going to be wearing a different shirt and making a lot more money. So I love watching professional basketball, but as much as I love watching professional basketball today, if I'm honest with you, I kind of miss the way it was in the 90s. Like, I mean, today we can hear athletes say, well, we just don't like that team, or I don't like that particular player, but when they're actually playing the game, it's not quite the same. In the 90s, though, you could feel that hatred coming off the television. I mean, if you were going up for a layup, you were taking your very life in your own hands on your way up there because a rival player may just clothesline you and knock you straight to the floor. It was just something that the guys in the 90s just seemed to be a lot tougher of basketball players than what we have today. They loved the idea of going out there night after night to prove that they were the best. They weren't going to let anything stop them from going out there and displaying their skill. I mean, Michael Jordan played a whole game with the flu. Reggie Miller made the entire city of New York. Think about that for a second. Reggie Miller made the entire city, the largest city in the world, he made them angry. And instead of shying away from that, he seemed to relish in that. I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that if Karl Malone's foot had fallen off in the middle of a game, he'd have gone to the bench, told the trainer, tape it up, I got to get back out there. The Pistons were known as the bad boys of basketball. These were men who were tough, who loved to demonstrate over and over again that they were the best there was. But somewhere in about the early 2010s, legendary Spurs coach Greg Popovich made a decision that would be considered highly controversial and inadvertently really changed the way that professional basketball is played to this day. It seemed kind of innocuous in the first place. It was just, on one particular game, Greg Popovich decided, I'm going to sit a couple of players down. See, the Spurs at that point in time, they weren't exactly the powerhouse that they had been 5-6 years beforehand. They still had their big stars of Tim Duncan and Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili. But those three men were starting to get a little up there, a little long in the tooth. They weren't exactly the same explosive team that they had been just a handful of years beforehand. They were getting older. And so for one particular game against the Miami Heat, Greg Popovich made the decision, I'm going to sit my three stars. Now you might be sitting there thinking, what's the big deal? A basketball coach decided to sit a couple of players. That happens at every level of basketball all the time. This was a nationally televised game. Not just that, it was the Spurs going up against the reigning champion Miami Heat. It was advertised as being Duncan and Parker and Ginobili against Chris Bosh and Dwayne Wade and LeBron James. This game was meant to be a huge ratings grab for the NBA. It was going to be a game that they could make millions of dollars off of just for this one particular game. But Popovich decided, I'm going to sit my stars. Basketball purists called it a disrespectful move towards the game. Sports writers referred to it as a gamble that couldn't possibly pay off. Then NBA Commissioner David Stern was so upset he called it an outrage against the fans, and he levied a $250,000 fine on the entire Spurs organization. A game that they were supposed to make a lot of money off of, they instead had to pay a fine on. But see, Popovich had an idea. He knew his team wasn't as young as they used to be. But they'd always made the playoffs. I mean, for the entire stretch of the 2000s all the way into the early 2010s, the Spurs had always at least been a playoff contender. And he had this thought, he had this crazy idea in his mind that since my guys aren't as young as they used to be, maybe they'd be better if I let them rest a game or two. If instead of having them play the grueling 82-game schedule all the time that included a lot of back-to-back games, maybe they might play better in the playoffs when it matters most if I let them rest. And people couldn't understand that. They couldn't wrap their minds around this idea that professional athletes needed an opportunity to rest. And Popovich's notion of this is going to help us come playoff time, they thought you may not make the playoffs because you're having these guys rest. It's a risk that Popovich took. It was a calculated idea. He was willing to sacrifice a game or two if it meant winning more later on. Nobody thought it was going to work. Every analyst was out there saying this was outrageous. There's no chance that this thing would ever work. And yet, Popovich's gamble ended up paying off in the long run. The Spurs did make the playoffs, albeit not as high a seed as they could have been had they won more games in the regular season, but they went on a tear come playoff time. Their stars were playing with an energy level that they had not demonstrated in a few years. They were playing out of their minds good, and they made their way all the way to the NBA Finals. And in a 7-game series that went all 7 games, they came up just short of winning the whole thing. And we might sit there and think, well, then that means the gamble didn't pay off. But every other coach in the NBA was watching what was going on there. They were watching what Greg Popovich was doing. They were hearing the lingo when he called it load management. And they began to adapt it themselves. All of a sudden you had big-name NBA stars sitting out games that really wouldn't matter in the long run. It extended NBA players' careers, has allowed for players who should have retired a few years ago to still be playing today because they've been given an opportunity to rest. Who would have possibly known that giving guys an opportunity to take a break, to take a night off, would end up having such a huge impact in the way that they would do their work later on? I think the reason why so many people were upset by this, why they were upset by this notion of load management and were upset at Greg Popovich, was because we're just naturally adverse to the notion of rest. We talked about this a little bit last week as we broke down this notion that we have this almost animosity towards the very concept of rest. We like to keep going and keep working, and even when we're at home, we're doing work around the house, and even when we're just out doing stuff, we still have to go find things to do. We can't seem to sit still for a moment. We have this natural inclination as human beings that we project our mindsets and our idolatry or our ideology onto other people. We expect them to live up to our standards. And that includes our very aversion to rest. Since we have a natural aversion to allowing ourselves to rest and refresh, we assume other people should share in that mindset. And if they don't share that mindset to us, we pressure them. We belittle them. We make them feel like they're lazy because of that. And so because we continue to live at an unhealthy standard and we require those around us to live at an unhealthy standard, we wonder why so many people are getting burnt out, of why they're having so much trouble, of why they're having so many health problems. The reality that we touched on last week is that we need rest in our lives. We need it in order to be at our physical, our mental, and even our spiritual best. It's a necessary part of our very lives. Without it, we run the risk of tremendous health problems if we don't have them already. Or if we have them already, we run the risk of making them far worse. Every expert in the area of rest and physical health and its correlation there all agree on one thing, that as human beings, we need to take at least one day a week off from rest, or off to rest, not from rest. If you're resting for 6 days and working one, that's not a great... Anyway, but We need these things in order to kind of keep our minds at their healthiest and keep our mental well-being at the focus that it needs to be at. We need it for our physical bodies to be able to rest, to get ready for the work that they've got ahead of us. And I believe that we need it for our spiritual health so that we can use that opportunity to reconnect with God, to dive deeper into His Word, to spend more time with Him in prayer. This notion of having a day off is not only is it not a new one, it's been around since the very foundation of the world. In fact, it's something that the more that I think about it, the more I find it to be kind of shocking if you think about the grand scheme of things. As God was finishing His creation, as He was working on everything else that was around Him, God took a day off. Like it's something we understand, we recognize it as being a fact, but we don't really think about that, do we? That God, the all-powerful, the almighty, the all-creating, the one who spoke the world into existence, who manufactured the universe in just 6 days, decided on the 7th, I'm going to take today. We see this play out. We find it in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, where it says this. It says, "So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed. On the 7th day, God had completed His work, and He said all that He had done, and He rested on the 7th day from all the work that He had done. God blessed the 7th day, declared it holy, for on it He rested from all His work of creation." Of course, this is just after God had finished His good work of creation. We know this. We know this story. He spent the previous days of the creation narrative kind of crafting and constructing everything that we know and everything that we haven't found yet. He formed the world in and of itself. He created the sun and the moon and the stars. He added water onto the planet so that it could separate the land from the sea. He spent a whole day creating all the creatures that we find in the air and in the water and on the land, and I think He took extra special time to make sure that turtles looked just ridiculous enough. I love turtles. God took the dust of the earth and He carefully sculpted and crafted and created man in His own image. And when He saw that that man was alone, He took part of that man and made a suitable helper for him that He called woman. He breathed His very essence into them, the breath of life. God did all of this stuff. He created everything, and He took a step back and He looked at His work and He kind of marveled at it and said, "It is very good." And then God decided to rest. Again, it's part of the creation narrative that we know, we understand it, but as we read through that creation narrative, we have a tendency to get so wrapped up in the 6 days ahead of this and marvel at the power and the glory and the amazingness that is God, that we kind of get to this portion right here and we read, oh yeah, then He took the day off. But did you see what He did before that? We downplay the fact that God, after He was finished with His creation, decided to take a day and rest. He was so delighted in this day off. It was something that was so significant, so important to Him that He actually went so far as to separate it, to make it holy. He was so happy with this sort of thing. He had a great day off, a great day of rest. And I don't know about you, but I got to ask the question, what did God do on His day off? Right? Like, did He go play golf with a couple of angels and say one day they're going to make this game and people are going to get really obsessed with it? Maybe it's just me that wonders that sort of thing. But, one of the things that we oftentimes miss in this notion of taking a day off of rest is that if God decided to take a day off, if God decided to take a day to rest, and we are created in the image of God, then shouldn't we value rest as well? Shouldn't we value that same day off? Shouldn't we decide that that's something that should be important to us? God, in His infinite wisdom, engineered us to need a day of Sabbath rest. In fact, God felt so strongly about this. He felt so inclined to believe that this day of rest was so very important that he made it a command, and not just any command. If you got a Bible, open it to Exodus chapter 20. We're going to be in verses 8 through 11 for just a minute here. Exodus chapter 20. We're going to see the importance that God had for this day of rest. Exodus chapter 20, starting in verse 8, it says this. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. You're to labor 6 days, do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who's within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days, then rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy." If this sounds familiar to you, if this particular passage of verses sounds like it's something familiar, it should. Because this command to take a day to rest, this is one of God's 10 commandments. Now think about this for a second. God had Moses go up to the top of this mountain so that God could speak directly to Moses. That wasn't exactly new. I mean, we'd seen other instances of God and man interacting with one another. But when Moses went up the mountain this particular time, God decided to give him a list. It was the first time that God had ever seemed to write anything down for humanity. He wrote down a list of 10 things, 10 expectations that God had for human beings in order to live up to his standards, to begin to live a godly life. And sure, Moses broke it, but he went back up there and God told him, write it down yourself this time. And the list remained the same. And so God, knowing that he was only going to give them a short list, just a brief synopsis of this is what you need in order to follow me properly, he thought it was so important for us to take a day off that he included it as part of his Big Ten, as part of his most important things for us to live by. God decided it was so important that we take a day off of rest so that we can reconnect with him, that it became one of his 10 commandments. This is a God that truly values the notion of rest. This is a God who truly expects us to allow ourselves to live a healthier lifestyle by taking some time off from our work. It's something that's we so easily pass by. I don't know if it's because, for most of us, we kind of learn the 10 Commandments when we're kids, and so we just kind of memorize it, and so we don't think that deeply into them. We're going to do a series on the 10 Commandments next year. Just, be ready for that. But we don't really examine these things. We don't really talk about them. And so when we get to this particular command to have a Sabbath day, to take a day of rest, we don't dive that deep into it. We just kind of give it a surface level thought. But God viewed it as so important to us, or for us, that he made it one of his commands. See, for us, it may not mean much. We may not look at it beyond that surface level, but for that first audience, those Israelites who had just been freed from Egypt, who had just gotten out of slavery, who were beginning to start to think about developing a nation for themselves, I'm guessing that this command probably stood out a little bit for them. See, understand, for the rest of the world, the sun was up, you worked. When the sun went down, that's when you stopped working. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have things to be able to prolong their work. They just knew that we had to get this done in 6 days. Or we had to get it done in 7 days. If the sun's up, you go to work. And so when God tells these people I'm getting really excited. When God tells these people about to begin their own nation, that they need to take a day off, that's something that would have been a challenge for them. See, because if they didn't work the ground for a day, that might mean their family wasn't going to get fed. If they didn't go work in order to make a living for that day, it may mean that they have to cut back, that they can't afford to do the things that they want to do or they feel they need to do. So this idea of taking a day off was something that was foreign to them. And it leads us to the question of why would God expect humanity to take a day off for rest? I think God did this for a couple of different reasons. But I think one that's most important is that God recognized this people was about to go and make a new nation. See, up till now, they'd been completely reliant on God. They didn't have the capability to make their own food, so God provided them with manna. When they decided they wanted meat, God gave them quail. In every capacity of whatever they needed, God provided it for them. They were dependent on God. They understood that God was in control. But when they go to develop their own homes, they can work to make their own food. They can provide for themselves on some level. And so I think God said, take this day off to rest, not just because your body needs it. Absolutely, that's a good reason to do it, but also to trust. To trust that God is going to handle it. To trust that God is going to remain in control. To trust that whatever it is that occupies your mind of the things that you have to do or the things that you need to do, God's got it taken care of. That God is going to continue to meet your need and make sure that you don't go without. God loves you so much so that you can let it go and trust that He's going to take care of it. This day of Sabbath rest, it was meant to be a benefit for us to not just get the rest that we need, but also to just trust that God was going to be able to handle things. It was meant to be a way for us to rely on Him, to create a sense of rest in Him. So it was almost inevitable that we as human beings would take this gift of a day of rest and turn it into another burden. See, when God said, rest from your labor, it's kind of broad. It leaves it open to interpretation, and as people continue to study the Word of God and continue to study what it was that He wanted from them, they saw rest from your labor, and they asked the inevitable question that we all ask, well, what is labor? What is work? And it turns out if you start to think about these sorts of things, a lot of things can be considered labor. A lot of things can be considered work. And so different teachers of Scripture, different Pharisees, different religious leaders, over the course of time, they began to come up with guidelines for how we're supposed to handle the Sabbath. And not only did they come up with guidelines, they treated those guidelines like they were law. To where it wasn't only expected that you do this, it was demanded that you do this. They created rules like you can only travel so far, or you can only write so much in a day. So if you want to write a letter to your sister who lives across, the country, keep it brief. They were so enveloped in this notion of what is and isn't work that there was actually a debate that went on that said, can we eat the egg of a chicken that gets laid on the Sabbath day? The chicken doesn't know it's the Sabbath. It just lays an egg. That's what chickens do. And yet they were so concerned with following the letter of the law that they took something that was meant to be a gift, an opportunity for us to take a break and rest, and they turned it into a greater burden. So when Jesus, God made flesh, came here to earth, He decided to help us out a little bit. He decided to remind us of a simple truth of what Sabbath is. And we saw Jesus over and over again perform miracles on the Sabbath. We're not going to talk about those particular stories. He did it to annoy the Pharisees. It was pretty great. I love it. But Jesus had something interesting to say, a simple truth about the Sabbath that He wanted to remind us of in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. And we're not going to read the whole thing because we're kind of running a little long on time here, but let me give you a synopsis of what goes on. Jesus and His disciples, they're walking through a grain field. And while they're walking their way through this grain field, His disciples, they get a little, let's call it snacky. Kind of hungry, but they're not, ready for a full meal. So they just did something that felt natural to them. They began picking the heads off of the grain around them and popping them in their mouth. I don't know if you've ever had raw grain before. It's not that flavorful, so they must have been pretty hungry. But the Pharisees see this going on, and they get furious. They get upset because picking grain is, well, that's work, and this is the Sabbath. You're supposed to be at rest. Not only are they upset the disciples are doing it, they're furious at Jesus because he's not doing anything to stop it. And they bring it to his attention. Why are you letting this go on? And Jesus reminds them of a story where David did something that was considered to be unlawful too, which I find interesting because it's kind of like, well, Sissy did it too, is what we get in the house all the time. Well, I didn't see your sister do it, but. But in the midst of that, Jesus says something to remind them about what the Sabbath really is. He says it in verse 27. It's an absolutely beautiful verse. It's the heart of this whole narrative. It says, then he told them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This day of a Sabbath rest, it was created for our benefit. It was created to help us, to ease our burden in life, not to create further burden for us. It's something that we continue to struggle with to this very day, this notion of taking an entire day off. We struggle against this day to take a rest, to relax. We far too often are thinking about the things that we have left to do. We're thinking about that to-do list. We're thinking about all the things we got to do around the house. We're thinking about all the things that are waiting for us when we get back to work. We're thinking about how we got to meal prep or how we got to get ready for supper or the laundry. We're thinking about the laundry. We cannot seem to bring ourselves to focus enough to allow our minds to rest. We struggle against the notion of taking a day of rest to remind ourselves that God is in control of it all. The Pharisees and other religious leaders, they struggled with that day so much that they put into practice and treated things that weren't what God had intended as if it was God's law. These restrictions and regulations ended up putting more of a burden on a day that was supposed to ease burden. You and I, we struggle to let a day pass without our involvement in it. We feel like we have to do something. We have to be involved, that if we're not there, things won't get done. Or at least they won't get done the right way. We feel like we have to handle everything in front of us. The Sabbath rest is us trusting that God is in control. So naturally, we struggle against that. Why? Because we feel like we have to be in control. The idea of relinquishing any control in our lives is so hard for us. It's probably the thing that we as humanity struggle with the most. Every single one of us wants to be in control. So trusting that God is in control is the hardest hurdle for us to conquer in our faith. But that's what Sabbath is meant to be. That's what this rest is meant to be. That's what this day off is meant to be, as a reminder that God's in control, that He's got this. God meant for Sabbath to be a benefit, not a burden. And yet we treat it like it's a burden. I shared with you last week, I struggle with this probably as much, if not more so, than some of us in this room. I don't handle days off all that well. I'm constantly thinking about the other things that need to happen, the other things I need to do. That my day off just becomes a day of different work. But understand that when we trust that God is in control, when we trust that God is in control of all things, that He's going to handle things even though we're not involved in it, that means that we are truly placing our faith, our whole faith, in Him. And then therefore, the day of Sabbath rest, that's an act of worship. It's a chance for us to trust that God is in control, to allow ourselves to breathe deeply, knowing that we don't need to handle it because God has got it. What could possibly be a better act of worship than trusting that God is in control? It's one thing to say it out loud. It's easy for me to stand here right now and say, trust that God is in control. It's a far different thing to actually put that into practice. to allow ourselves that opportunity to take a rest, to trust that God is going to handle it without our involvement for a whole day. But God viewed that as so important, he made it part of his 10 commandments. So when we allow ourselves to rest and trust that God is in control, then we are truly worshiping. Understand the work can wait. Whatever it is that's occupying your mind, let it go. Rest. Trust. Have faith. He's got it. This week I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to take a Sabbath rest. That's hard, I know. Take a whole day, especially this time of the year. Take a whole day and just rest. Trust that God is in control. Trust that he's got this. Trust that he's going to handle things. It doesn't mean that you need to follow some imaginary list of rules like don't walk so far, don't write so much, or any of that nonsense. What's restful and recreational to you is maybe different, is work for me, but if it relaxes you, then great. Take that opportunity to find that rest. Fill your entire day with something that isn't on your to-do list. Fill it with rest. Fill it with recreation. Fill it with fun. Trust that God's in control. Because I promise you, the world will continue to spin without you in it. That thing that you know you got to do, it's waited this long. That project at home you've been putting off for months, one more day ain't going to hurt. Take an opportunity to rest. Fill that day with worship. Fill it with prayer. I think you'll find it's exactly what you needed when you find your rest in God. Psalm 62 verses 5 through 8 say this, and we'll close with it. It says, "Rest in God alone, my soul, for my hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation and my stronghold. I will not be shaken. My salvation and glory depend on God, my strong rock. My refuge is in God." This is the big one. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is our refuge.